Every year, I chuckled to myself as I stooped down to harvest the handful of healthy-sized morels that had sprung out of the ground at the base of the old oak tree that stood at the top of the hill of these woods. Every year for as long as I could remember, morel mushrooms could always be found in this spot, always in good shape, always a good amount, only in the spring. It was the certainty of this annual foraging that led to the naming of this area as Morel Mound by everyone who wandered here, and in my 30-some years of walking through these woodlands, I'd never heard anyone call it anything else. As I tossed the mushrooms into my bag with others I'd found, I made my way east, down the hill, and worked carefully to the holler below. Head on down to Stone House, eat some lunch, smoke a cigarette, head south through the holler. I plotted to myself as I stepped absent-mindedly around the trees and over the high brushes all around me. All of them familiar. I always admired how the forest could be so dynamic yet eternally static. Nothing moves, as it always changes. After 20 minutes or so, my path eventually led me to my self-designated resting spot. Stone House was exactly what it suggested. A stone house between a mess of trees, older than anyone can remember. As stuck in time as the stones and hills it rested on. The roof had long since decayed, but the stone frame, though consumed by vines and moss, had held up considerably well. As kids, my brother and I would spend hours out at Stone House playing cowboys and Indians or knights who defended their keep. As teenagers, we'd camp out here and have parties with our friends, but as adults, we'd simply rest out here, eat our lunches, reminisce on the ghosts of our youth, and look forward to the days our children found the same joys here as their fathers did. Stepping through the threshold of the ruined cottage, I was met with cleared dirt flooring, and at the back of the single-roomed cottage were the thrones. My brother and I, as children, had spent months carving 2 big chairs out of chunks of a birch tree that our father had cut down. Once they were complete, and to our likings, we hauled them up the hill, one at a time, and through the heavy wooden seats facing out of the single caved-in wall in that stone house had. We had built our thrones, we had fought the hill, and in our childlike minds we had earned our places as kings of the forest. The caved-in wall allowed us to survey all around our kingdom whenever we pleased, and even as adults we still found ourselves sitting on these seats, and though we knew it wasn't true, to sit in these chairs still gave me a whimsical sense of royalty. "It's good to be king," I said, smiling as I raised my canteen to the lands around me. The same old trees, the same old stone house, the same foolish and careless kid, always changing, but always the same. The sun was out, the skies were clear, and God was above all, and it was with these thoughts and feelings that I lulled myself to sleep under the warm spring sun. I jolted awake with the overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. Even though my mind told me to jump out of my seat, my body, which had been slumped awkwardly in a chair for a long time, disagreed with the attempt. My tailbone and my neck were stiff and painful. As I groaned and waited for the stiffness to subside, I scanned my surroundings. The sun was low in the sky, casting giant shadows around everything. Orange and yellow could be seen painted through the trees, but everything else around me was casted as a dark silhouette. The air had grown colder, and harsh winds would occasionally break through the trees and send a shiver down my spine. It was within one of these gusts of wind that I heard something. It sounded low and drawn out, almost like a groan of dismay. I stopped pulling myself up, almost frozen. Every sense of my being was on high alert. I listened intently into the woods ahead of me in some kind of attempt to decipher what that sound was. I listened for several more moments and rationalized that it must have just been the wind going through the trees in a strange way. I stood myself up from out of the throne and planned to make my way back up the hill and towards home. Going through the holler would take too long, and I wouldn't have enough daylight going that way. I'd barely have enough to backtrack with. As I stepped across the dirt floor, I heard the voice again, louder this time, and much more obvious. Instead of fading with the wind now, the voice continued. What I thought was just the wind was very quickly turning into the sound of someone crying loudly. Not just crying, but wailing. At first, I thought that it must be a lost hiker or someone in trouble, but as the wailing continued, I realized that something wasn't human about the sounds I was hearing. There was crying, but there wasn't any tearfulness, is the best I can describe it. It wasn't the sound someone makes when they're crying. It was more like the sound someone might make if they were trying to sound like they were crying, like an imitation. Petrified with sudden fear, I stared wide-eyed into the trees as the cry sounds became closer and louder almost by the moment. It seemed to come from everywhere. Sometimes I was sure it was coming from the doorway, sometimes from west side of the house. Miraculously, I was able to snap out of my panic enough to crouch behind the large birch seats and attempt to hide from whatever horrible thing was heading right towards me. The cry sounds grew louder and louder, and after only a few seconds had begun to turn into cry screams. The same bland and emotionless tone in the shouts amplified to a terror-inducing level of volume. Just as I was about to scream, the woods fell silent. As I listened intensely to the world around me, I was met with nothing but dead silence. Nothing. No wind or crickets or night birds. It's as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation to what was happening and what was going to happen next. As I cowered in catatonically behind the thrones, I began try and plan some kind of escape. I've got to sneak away. I've got to sneak away. I shouted at myself internally. But I can't. I'll make too much noise. It'll hear me. If I run, it'll catch me. My thoughts were harshly interrupted by the heavy footfalls on the other side of my hiding place. Unnaturally heavy footfalls, as if someone was dropping boulders in perfect rhythm across the forest floor. It's good to be king. The same mock voice droned emptily through the darkness. It was exactly as I had said it, but so awfully wrong. The inflectuation was the same, the words were the same, but there was no life in it. It's good to be king again. The voice resonated hauntingly. Whatever was copying my words was right on the other side of my hiding place. My heart banged in my chest ferociously. I wanted to scream, I wanted to weep, but I couldn't do anything. I had become a part of the stone house, fused in a whimpering mess to the dirt floor and the vine-covered walls. It's good to every. The empty words ended and morphed into something else, a sound that I could only describe as death. The screams of men and women and children and animals all fused together into one monstrous, hell-like bellowing. The feelings of dread and agony that could be felt with the wailing held the same empty effect that had preceded this could still be heard as the core of all the chaos around me. My fear had become so primal, so overwhelming, and all-encompassing that my body completely disconnected from any rationale my mind might have had. Autopilot kicked in, and I could feel myself standing up and sprinting away from my hiding place and through sunset matinee of the woods, screaming at the top of my lungs and pleading to whatever might listen to save me. I sprinted madly through the forest for what felt like hours, always certain that the horrible thing was coming after me. I could feel it waiting behind every tree, waiting to grab me from under every log. At times I swore I could feel it right behind me. I ran as fast and as hard as I could. Nothing was familiar anymore, and the trees I had so absent-mindedly stepped around earlier in the day were now working against me. Cut and bruised and exhausted, I finally burst out of the tree line and into the perimeter of my yard. I could see my house. I was almost there. My glimmer of hope was quickly reinstated with the newly familiar dread when from mere feet behind me, I began to hear the lifeless voice again, back to its low sobbing sounds. Looking for me in the trees, with all my remaining strength I stumbled across the yard, threw myself into the house, and slammed the door shut, locking and bolting it behind me. I fell onto the floor exhausted, too exhausted to barricade, too winded to try and call someone. I wasn't going anywhere. I prayed that whatever was out there didn't find me. Somehow I managed to pull myself up and plop myself onto a chair in my living room. Cautiously, I turned my head right and looked out the window. And that's where I saw it. Pacing at the tree line of my dimly lit yard was the silhouette of something large and terrible. It walked on two hoofed feet, but irrefutably had paws where hands should be on its giant, muscled arms. Atop of the creature's shoulders where its head should be a deer's skull. Antlers protruded out against the lights in the yard. Huge, sharp teeth could be seen jutting out of the skinless jaw. In a slow, lumbering fashion, it paced around the yard. It didn't appear to be looking. It seemed like it was listening, or trying to sense or smell something. Unable to move from my position on the chair, I could merely stare at the horrible thing and pray that it didn't see me. After what felt like an eternity, the creature stopped in its tracks and began to make the fake crying sounds again. As it did, it lumbered off into the tree line and out of sight. After a while, the cries faded into the pitch-black darkness of the woods. I don't think I slept for days after that night in the woods, and when I finally did, my dreams were haunted by that horrible night. I never told anyone, because who would believe something like that? How could I tell someone about something like that? Though I've never seen or heard anything like that since, it still took me a very long time to venture back out into those woods. And I will never go to Stonehouse again. Sometimes in my dreams I'm running wildly through the woods trying to get away. Some nights I'm hiding behind the thrones, but then there are other nights. Nights where I'm not quick enough. Nights where it finds me. And my screams of pain and dying are added to the creature's horrible, lifeless cacophony.